I don't know where you managed to steal this ticket from, sweetie, but Horizon Airlines doesn't run a charity service for people who clearly can't afford to sit in first class." The words sliced through the ambient noise of LAX Terminal 4 like a blade through silk, sharp and deliberate, designed to wound and humiliate in the most public way possible. Rebecca Sterling stood behind Gate 23's pristine counter. Her platinum blonde hair pulled back in a bun so tight it stretched the skin around her temples, making her expression appear even more severe than nature had intended. Her Horizon Airlines uniform was pressed to military precision, every crease sharp enough to cut paper, every button polished to mirror brightness. At 42 years old, she had worked her way up from a baggage handler at a regional carrier to senior gate agent at one of the most exclusive airlines in the industry, and she wore that authority like armor. The young woman standing before her didn't flinch, didn't step backward, didn't show even the slightest tremor of intimidation. Jasmine Washington, 23 years old, and wearing a faded NYU hoodie that had seen her through 3 years of law school, simply stared at Rebecca with the kind of calm composure that comes from understanding exactly how power works, and refusing to be diminished by those who wield it carelessly. "That's my boarding pass," Jasmine said quietly, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around her, despite the dozens of eyes suddenly focused on this confrontation that had materialized out of nowhere like a summer storm. Seat 1. A first-class LAX to Atlanta. The Friday evening rush at Terminal 4 had been typical until this moment. Delayed flights, frustrated passengers clutching boarding passes and checking their watches, the constant hum of CNN from overhead monitors mixing with gate announcements and the persistent clicking of rolling luggage across polished floors. But now conversations stopped mid-sentence. Newspapers lowered. Even children paused in their restless wandering between the black leather seats, as something in Rebecca's tone made it clear that this wasn't going to be a simple customer service interaction. Rebecca's perfectly manicured fingers smoothed an imaginary wrinkle from her blazer as she looked down at Jasmine with the kind of smile that never quite reached the eyes, the practiced expression of someone who had perfected the art of condescension through years of dealing with what she considered problematic passengers. "Sweetheart," she said, her voice dripping with false concern that fooled no one within earshot. "I've been working this gate for 16 years, and in that time I've developed what you might call quality control instincts about these situations." She gestured toward Jasmine's outfit with barely concealed disdain, taking in the worn canvas sneakers that had carried her through countless late-night library sessions, the faded hoodie that bore the stains of too many coffee-fueled study marathons, the canvas messenger bag that looked like it had been purchased at a thrift store rather than a high-end boutique. "I know what our first-class passengers look like." Rebecca continued, her voice rising just enough to ensure that everyone in the boarding area could hear her assessment, and they don't look like they just rolled out of a college dormitory after pulling an all-nighter. The gate area, packed with delayed passengers from Flight HZ-2847 to Atlanta, had gone completely quiet in that uncomfortable way that happens when strangers realize they're about to witness something that will make them question their faith in human decency. Business travelers in expensive suits shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Families with young children pulled their kids closer, as if discrimination might be contagious. And even the airport staff working at nearby gates had begun to notice that something unusual was happening at Gate 23. Diego Martinez, the junior gate agent who had been quietly handling computer check-ins behind his terminal, shifted nervously as he watched his supervisor begin what looked like it might become the kind of incident that generates corporate memos and mandatory sensitivity training. His dark eyes darted between Rebecca and Jasmine, then toward the growing crowd of onlookers, his fingers hovering uncertainly over his keyboard as he debated whether to intervene in what was clearly becoming a situation that could spiral out of control very quickly. Near the back of the priority boarding line, Taylor Kim had been casually documenting her travel experience for her 15,000 Instagram followers, the kind of routine airport content that filled the dead time between flights. Delayed departures, overpriced terminal food, the usual complications of Friday evening air travel. She had started recording what she thought would be a quick story about gate delays, but something in the tension radiating from the front of the line made her keep the camera rolling. Her influencer instincts recognizing that whatever was unfolding here was going to be worth documenting. Jasmine reached into the front pocket of her hoodie with deliberate calm, the kind of measured movement that suggested someone who had learned through hard experience never to make sudden gestures when being scrutinized by authority figures who had already decided she didn't belong where she was standing. She pulled out her phone, the screen displaying her mobile boarding pass with perfect clarity. The QR code dark and sharp against the white background, the flight details crisp and unmistakable, the seat assignment printed in bold letters that couldn't be misread or misinterpreted. "I have a digital copy right here," she said, holding the phone toward Rebecca so she could see the boarding pass clearly displayed on the screen. "You can scan it if you'd like to verify that it's authentic and that I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Rebecca didn't even glance at the phone screen. Instead, crossing her arms and shaking her head with the kind of theatrical disappointment that suggested she had encountered this exact situation countless times before and was tired of dealing with passengers who didn't understand their place in the hierarchy of air travel. "Digital passes can be photoshopped, honey," she announced loudly enough for everyone in the priority boarding area to hear her expert assessment. Any college student with basic computer skills and access to a decent printer could fake one of those. She turned slightly toward the passengers waiting in line behind Jasmine, playing to her audience like a performer who had found her stage and intended to make the most of it. "You'd be amazed what people will try these days," she continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone who considered herself the last line of defense against fraud and deception. "They see an opportunity to upgrade themselves into a cabin they can't afford, and they'll use whatever technology they can get their hands on to make it happen." A murmur rippled through the crowd of waiting passengers as Rebecca's implications settled into the minds of business travelers who had paid premium prices for their first-class seats and now found themselves wondering if the young woman in front of them was attempting some elaborate scam that might delay their departure even further. An elderly man in an expensive business suit frowned and adjusted his reading glasses to get a better look at the confrontation, while a mother traveling with her teenage daughter pulled the girl closer and whispered something that made them both stare at Jasmine with suspicious curiosity. The boarding announcement chimed overhead with its pleasant electronic melody, the sound almost mocking in the increasingly tense atmosphere that had settled over Gate 23 like a fog. "Ladies and gentlemen, Horizon Airlines Flight HZ2847 to Atlanta is now boarding first-class passengers and Diamond Elite members," the automated voice announced with cheerful efficiency. "Please have your boarding passes ready for scanning and proceed to the gate when your zone is called." Jasmine stepped forward, her posture straight and confident, her eyes meeting Rebecca's gaze directly in the way that had always made her professors at NYU Law School recognize her as someone who wouldn't be easily intimidated or dismissed. "I'm first class," she said simply, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly what she was entitled to and wasn't going to be talked out of it. "Seat 1A. I'd like to board now, please." Rebecca's face flushed red beneath her carefully applied foundation, the color creeping up her neck like a thermometer measuring rising anger and frustration. She stepped out from behind the counter, her heels clicking aggressively against the polished terminal floor as she positioned herself directly in front of Jasmine, blocking her path to the jet bridge, with the kind of physical intimidation that was designed to make passengers back down without airport security having to get involved. "You know what Rebecca said?" her voice taking on an edge that cut through the ambient noise of the terminal like a warning siren. "I'm getting tired of this little game we're playing here, and I think it's time we resolved this situation once and for all so that our legitimate passengers can board this aircraft and get to their destinations on time." She crossed her arms and stared down at Jasmine with the expression of someone who had decided that diplomacy had failed, and it was time to assert her authority through more direct means. You're not boarding this aircraft, period, and I don't care what kind of documentation you think you have or what kind of story you've prepared to try to convince me that you belong in our first-class cabin." On what grounds Jasmine asked, her legal training automatically kicking in as she recognized that Rebecca had just made a definitive statement that would need to be justified according to both corporate policy and federal aviation regulations. "On the grounds that I said so," Rebecca replied, her voice loud enough for the entire gate area to hear every word of her declaration. "I am the senior gate agent for this flight, and I have the authority to make determinations about who boards and who doesn't, based on my professional judgment and 16 years of experience in this industry, and I'm determining that you—" She pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at Jasmine's face. "Don't belong in first class." The silence that followed was absolute and uncomfortable. The kind of quiet that descends when a crowd of strangers realizes they're witnessing something that crosses lines they didn't even know existed until they saw them being trampled. Even the ambient airport noise seemed to pause, as if the entire terminal was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next in this confrontation that had moved far beyond normal customer service into territory that made everyone uncomfortable. Diego Martinez watched from behind his computer terminal, his stomach tight with anxiety, as he realized that his supervisor was creating exactly the kind of incident that generates viral social media coverage and congressional hearings about discrimination in the airline industry. At 26 years old, he had been working for Horizon Airlines for just over 2 years. Long enough to understand the company culture, but not long enough to feel secure about challenging authority when that authority was clearly overstepping its bounds. He glanced at his computer screen where Jasmine's reservation was displayed in perfect detail. Seat 1. A first-class full-fare payment by credit card booked 3 weeks in advance with no special codes, no upgrade certificates, no irregularities of any kind that would justify the treatment she was receiving. It would take him 30 seconds to scan her digital boarding pass and confirm what the computer was already showing him. But Rebecca was his supervisor, and questioning her judgment in front of passengers would undermine her authority and potentially cost him his job in an industry that was notoriously unforgiving toward employees who couldn't follow the chain of command. Taylor Kim, meanwhile, had quietly repositioned herself to get a better angle for her phone camera, her influencer instincts recognizing that whatever was happening at Gate 23 was rapidly becoming the kind of content that could change careers and generate millions of views if handled properly. Her live stream, which had started with maybe 50 viewers interested in routine travel content, was now climbing toward 300 as word spread through social media that something dramatic was unfolding at LAX. "Y'all," she whispered into her phone, keeping her voice low enough not to interrupt the confrontation, but clear enough for her viewers to understand the gravity of what they were witnessing. "This is getting really uncomfortable to watch. And I honestly can't believe what this gate agent is saying to this young woman who seems to have perfectly valid documentation." Comments were already flooding her live stream as viewers recognized the racial dynamics at play in Rebecca's treatment of Jasmine. "This is so racist," appeared multiple times in her comment feed, along with, "Someone needs to report this," and "That girl is handling this way better than I would," and "What airline is this because I'm never flying with them?" Rebecca, completely unaware that her behavior was being broadcast to hundreds of people and would soon be shared across multiple social media platforms, continued her confrontation with the kind of confidence that comes from 16 years of unchallenged authority over passenger boarding decisions. She had developed what she called her professional instincts over nearly 2 decades in aviation, and those instincts were telling her that Jasmine represented exactly the kind of problem passenger who tried to take advantage of system errors, employee mistakes, or outright fraud to upgrade herself into services she hadn't paid for. Everything about Jasmine's appearance screamed college student trying to pass for premium passenger. The worn clothing, the casual sneakers, the messenger bag that looked like it had been purchased at a thrift store rather than a boutique, the slightly hunched shoulders of someone who wasn't entirely comfortable in the first-class boarding area. Rebecca had seen this pattern dozens of times before, and she had built her reputation on catching these attempts before they could board the aircraft and create problems for the flight crew. But something about Jasmine's reaction was different from what Rebecca had experienced with previous suspected upgraders. Instead of the nervous fidgeting she associated with passengers who knew they were in the wrong place, Jasmine displayed a calm confidence that suggested she genuinely believed she belonged exactly where she was standing. When Rebecca challenged her documentation, Jasmine didn't offer defensive explanations or stammering excuses. She simply provided the requested information with the kind of measured response that suggested someone who understood her rights and wasn't going to be intimidated into giving them up. That confidence irritated Rebecca more than obvious guilt would have, because it suggested that this particular scammer thought she was smarter than the system, that she could outsmart a 16-year veteran with nothing more than a fake boarding pass and an attitude that refused to acknowledge the reality of her situation. The departure board above their heads flashed an updated boarding time in bold red letters, and the jet bridge stood empty, waiting for passengers who were instead gathered around Gate 23, watching a confrontation that was rapidly spiraling beyond anyone's control. Security cameras mounted on the terminal walls captured every angle of what was happening, creating a comprehensive record that would be impossible to deny or explain away later. Ma'am Diego said softly, finally finding the courage to step forward from behind his computer terminal. Maybe we should just scan the digital boarding pass and verify the reservation. It would only take a few seconds to confirm everything in our system. Rebecca's voice cracked like a whip, sharp enough to make several passengers flinch at the sudden volume. I'll handle this situation, and you'll get back to your assigned duties at that computer terminal where you belong, instead of questioning my professional judgment in front of our passengers. She turned back to Jasmine with renewed determination, her authority having been challenged not just by the passenger, but now by her own subordinate, which meant she needed to reassert control over the entire situation before it spiraled completely out of her grasp. Miss, she said, her voice carrying the kind of official tone that was designed to sound reasonable to anyone who might later review recordings of the incident, I'm going to need you to step back from the boarding line and allow our confirmed first-class passengers to proceed to the aircraft. Jasmine remained exactly where she was, her canvas bag hanging from her shoulder, her phone still displaying the digital boarding pass that Rebecca refused to acknowledge. I am a confirmed first-class passenger, she replied, her voice maintaining the same steady calm that had characterized her responses throughout this increasingly surreal encounter. I have valid documentation, proper identification, and I'm here on time for boarding. What exactly is the problem? Rebecca's eyes conducted a slow, deliberate examination from Jasmine's scuffed sneakers to her faded hoodie, the kind of visual assessment that was designed to make its target feel exposed and inadequate. Sweetie, she said, her voice taking on the patronizing tone of someone explaining something obvious to a child. I understand there might be some confusion about your seat assignment, but premium cabin service requires certain standards that exist to protect the experience our paying customers expect when they invest in first-class travel. The words hung in the air like smoke, their implications clear to everyone within earshot. Several passengers in the boarding line turned to stare more openly, their curiosity now mixed with the uncomfortable recognition that they were witnessing discrimination disguised as customer service. An elderly woman wearing a Chanel suit raised her eyebrows in surprise at Rebecca's boldness, while a businessman in a tailored coat shook his head and returned to his newspaper, clearly assuming the situation would resolve itself without requiring his intervention. Are you suggesting that I don't belong in first class because of how I'm dressed? Jasmine asked, her legal training automatically formulating the question in a way that would force Rebecca to either back down or admit to discrimination in front of dozens of witnesses. Rebecca realized she was venturing into potentially problematic territory, but she had gone too far to retreat now without looking weak and ineffective in front of all these passengers. I'm suggesting that there are standards, dear expectations that our first-class passengers pay premium prices to experience, and that includes maintaining an environment where everyone feels comfortable with their fellow travelers. Since when does Horizon Airlines have a dress code for passengers? Jasmine pressed, recognizing that Rebecca was digging herself deeper into legally questionable territory with every statement. It's not an official dress code, Rebecca replied quickly, her customer service training finally kicking in as she realized she needed to be more careful about how she phrased her objections. It's about comfort, about making sure all our passengers feel comfortable with the level of service and the atmosphere they're paying for when they choose to fly first class with Horizon Airlines. Diego cleared his throat softly from behind his computer terminal, his cursor hovering over the passenger manifest that clearly showed Seat 1A occupied by Jay Washington with full first-class fare payment and no irregularities that would justify the treatment she was receiving. Rebecca, he said quietly, maybe we should just verify the reservation in the system before we... Diego. Rebecca cut him off without turning around, her voice carrying a warning that made it clear his continued employment might depend on following her lead in this situation. Please handle the general boarding announcement and let me manage this particular passenger issue according to company policy and my professional experience. Jasmine pulled her phone from her pocket and opened the Horizon Airlines app, displaying her boarding pass on the screen with crystal clarity. The QR code was sharp and dark, the confirmation number clearly visible, the flight details perfect in every detail that mattered for boarding purposes. Here's my boarding pass, she said, holding the phone toward Rebecca so she could see every detail of the legitimate documentation. Digital confirmation number, seat assignment, flight details. Would you like me to show you the credit card I used to purchase it? Rebecca glanced at the phone screen for just a moment before looking away, her expression suggesting that she had seen something that contradicted her assumptions, but wasn't ready to acknowledge that contradiction in front of all these witnesses. Digital confirmations can be manipulated. Sweetie, she said, her voice taking on the lecturing tone of someone explaining technology to someone she assumed didn't understand it. College students these days are very clever with computers and photo editing software. She turned toward the other passengers in line, seeking their support for her position by appealing to their shared concerns about travel security. I apologize for the delay, folks, she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who believed she was protecting them from a potential problem. We'll have this sorted out momentarily, but I want you to know that I take your safety and security very seriously, which means verifying questionable documentation before allowing passengers to board. A man in an expensive Italian suit stepped forward from his position in the boarding line, his expression showing the kind of impatience that comes from having connecting flights and no time for unnecessary delays. Excuse me, he said to Rebecca, but is there actually a problem here? My connection in Atlanta is tight, and we're already running behind schedule. No problem at all, sir, Rebecca assured him with the kind of professional smile that was designed to calm concerned premium passengers. Just verifying some documentation according to federal aviation security requirements. We'll begin first-class boarding in just a moment. Her documentation looks perfectly fine to me, the man replied, glancing at Jasmine's phone where the boarding pass was still clearly displayed. I can see the QR code and the seat assignment from here, and frankly, I don't understand what's taking so long when we have a plane to catch. Rebecca felt her authority being challenged, not just by the passenger she was trying to remove, but now by the very people she thought she was protecting with her vigilant security measures. Her cheek muscles twitched with the strain of maintaining her professional composure while feeling control of the situation slipping away from her grasp. Sir Rebecca said, her voice rising slightly as she felt the need to justify her actions to passengers who were supposed to be supporting her authority rather than questioning it. I appreciate your concern about our departure time, but airline security requires that I use my professional judgment to ensure passenger safety and comfort. And in my professional judgment, there are serious questions about this passenger's documentation that need to be resolved before anyone boards this aircraft. The businessman frowned, looking back and forth between Rebecca and Jasmine with the expression of someone trying to understand how a simple boarding process had turned into what appeared to be a discrimination incident. What questions, he asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting straight answers to direct questions. She has a boarding pass. She has identification. She's here on time for departure. What exactly is the question? Rebecca realized she was being backed into a corner where she would either have to admit that her objections were based on assumptions about Jasmine's appearance and economic status, or she would have to escalate the situation to a level that might attract the kind of attention she really didn't want from airport security or corporate management. Her 16 years of experience had taught her that most passengers would eventually back down when faced with official authority. But Jasmine wasn't backing down, and now other passengers were beginning to question her judgment. The question Rebecca said, her voice taking on the hard edge of someone who had decided that diplomacy had failed, and it was time to assert her authority through more direct means, is whether this passenger actually purchased this ticket legitimately, or whether she's trying to take advantage of some computer error or system glitch to upgrade herself into a cabin she can't afford and doesn't belong in. The words came out harder and more direct than Rebecca had intended, crossing the line from professional skepticism into personal attack in a way that made everyone within earshot uncomfortable. Gasps rippled through the crowd of waiting passengers as they realized they were witnessing something that had moved far beyond routine customer service into territory that felt discriminatory and wrong. Taylor Kim's phone captured every word for her live stream, which had now climbed past 500 viewers as word spread through social media that something dramatic was unfolding at LAX Gate 23. Her comment section was flooding with reactions from viewers who were watching discrimination happen in real time. Did she just accuse her of fraud? And this is racist as hell, and someone needs to call corporate immediately, and I'm crying. This is so wrong. Are you accusing me of fraud? Jasmine asked, her voice maintaining its steady calm, even as Rebecca's accusations became more direct and potentially actionable under both civil and criminal law. I'm not accusing anyone of anything. Rebecca backtracked quickly, her customer service training reminding her that direct accusations of criminal behavior could expose both her and the airline to significant legal liability. I'm simply following established procedures to ensure that all passengers have legitimate documentation for their assigned seats. You just accused me of using a computer error to steal an upgrade, Jasmine replied, her legal training helping her recognize the significance of what Rebecca had said in front of dozens of witnesses. That's a fraud accusation, and I'd like you to either provide evidence for that accusation or retract it immediately. Rebecca looked around the gate area, suddenly aware of how many people were watching this confrontation unfold, of how many phones were pointed in her direction, capturing every word she spoke for potential social media sharing. Even airport staff from other gates had begun to notice the commotion, creating an audience that was much larger than she had intended when she first approached Jasmine about her boarding pass. Then, resolve the questions, Jasmine continued, her voice carrying a new edge that suggested she was running out of patience with Rebecca's evasions and delays. Scan my boarding pass. Check your computer system. Do whatever company policy actually requires, instead of making assumptions about whether I belong here based on how I look or how I'm dressed. Rebecca felt the situation spiraling completely out of her control, with passengers questioning her authority, her subordinate showing signs of wanting to intervene, and her target refusing to be intimidated into backing down. But admitting she was wrong now in front of all these people would undermine everything she had built over 16 years of establishing herself as someone who couldn't be fooled or manipulated by passengers trying to scam the system. "Ma'am," she said, straightening her shoulders and making what she knew might be her final attempt to resolve this situation while saving face. "I'm going to ask you one more time to step aside and allow our confirmed first-class passengers to board this aircraft. If you refuse to cooperate with airline security procedures, I'll have no choice but to call airport security to have you removed from the boarding area." "Fine. Jasmine said, reaching into her back pocket with the kind of deliberate movement that suggested someone who had been prepared for exactly this kind of challenge to her right to travel. I happen to have a printed boarding pass as well, just in case there were any questions about the digital version. She pulled out a folded piece of paper and handed it directly to Rebecca, who took it with obvious reluctance. The boarding pass was pristine white cardstock with Horizon Airlines' signature gold foil strip along the top edge, the kind of high-quality printing that the airline used for its premium passengers. Every detail was perfect. The barcode was dark and clear. The seat assignment was printed in bold letters next to the first-class designation, and the confirmation number matched the digital version exactly. Rebecca held the boarding pass under the fluorescent terminal lighting, turning it over in her hands and running her fingers across the gold foil strip as if she might discover some flaw that would justify her continued suspicions. The printing quality was flawless, the paper weight exactly right, the perforated edges clean and professional. Everything about the document screamed authenticity to anyone who had ever seen legitimate airline documentation. "The printing quality is quite good," Rebecca announced loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear her assessment, as if the professional appearance of the boarding pass was somehow evidence of sophisticated forgery rather than legitimate documentation. Very professional, looking for something that could have been created with the right equipment and technical knowledge. "Because it's real," Jasmine replied simply, her patience with this entire process wearing thinner with each passing moment of scrutiny and skepticism. Rebecca walked over to Diego's computer station, still holding Jasmine's boarding pass like it might contaminate her if she handled it too carelessly. "Diego," she called out, her voice carrying across the gate area, as if she were conducting a public investigation rather than verifying routine travel documentation. "What do you think? Does this boarding pass look authentic to you in your professional opinion?" Diego glanced at the boarding pass, then at his computer screen, where Jasmine's valid reservation was still clearly displayed, then back at Rebecca with obvious confusion about why she was asking him to verify documentation that clearly matched their computer records. "It looks standard to me," he said carefully, aware that his answer was being recorded by multiple passengers and might be reviewed later by corporate management. "Same cardstock we've been using for the past 6 months, same printing format, same security features." "Look closer," Rebecca insisted, her voice taking on a note of desperation, as she realized that even her own subordinate wasn't supporting her position. "Sometimes the counterfeits can be very sophisticated, especially when someone has access to high-quality printing equipment and knows what security features to replicate." Diego took the boarding pass from Rebecca and examined it more carefully under his desk lamp, checking the paperweight, the gold foil, the barcode format, and the confirmation number that matched the pattern used by their reservation system. Everything about the document felt correct in his hands. The weight, the texture, the way the light reflected off the security features that would be nearly impossible to replicate without access to airline printing systems. "Rebecca," he said quietly, hoping to end this confrontation before it escalated any further, "this looks completely legitimate to me. I think we should just scan it and process the boarding so we can get this flight departed on schedule." "I'll decide what we should do," Rebecca snapped, snatching the boarding pass back from Diego's hands with enough force to make him step backward. "You handle the computer system, and I'll handle passenger verification according to the authority and responsibility that comes with being the senior agent at this gate." She returned to where Jasmine was standing with the boarding pass held at arm's length, as if maintaining physical distance from the document might somehow reveal the deception she was convinced must be hidden within its perfect printing and legitimate appearance. "The thing about counterfeits these days," Rebecca announced to the growing crowd of passengers who were now openly staring at this unprecedented confrontation, "is that technology has made them incredibly sophisticated, especially when someone has access to high-quality printing equipment and specialty papers that can mimic authentic airline documentation. A woman standing in the middle of the boarding line finally lost patience with the entire spectacle and spoke up with the kind of authority that comes from years of business travel and premium customer status. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying across the gate area with crisp, professional clarity. "But this is absolutely ridiculous. Just scan the boarding pass and let this young woman board the aircraft so we can all get to Atlanta on time." Rebecca turned to face the woman with her practiced customer service smile, the expression she had perfected for handling passengers who didn't understand the complexities of airline security procedures. "Ma'am, I understand your impatience with this process, but airline security is nothing to take lightly in today's travel environment. Would you really want someone with potentially fraudulent documentation sitting next to you at 30,000 feet? I'd want you to do your job efficiently instead of harassing a young woman who clearly has valid documentation," the businesswoman replied, her voice carrying the kind of authority that suggested she wasn't intimidated by Rebecca's attempts to justify discriminatory behavior through appeals to security concerns. Rebecca's professional smile faltered as she realized that the premium passengers she thought she was protecting were instead turning against her, questioning her judgment, and supporting the very passenger she was trying to remove from their exclusive cabin. "I'm trying to do my job," she said, her voice taking on a defensive edge which involves ensuring the safety and security of all passengers by carefully verifying documentation when legitimate questions arise. "What questions?" the businesswoman pressed her tone, suggesting she expected specific answers rather than vague references to security concerns. "She has a boarding pass, she has proper identification. She's here on time for departure." What exactly is the question that requires all this drama and delay? Rebecca looked back at Jasmine's boarding pass in her hands, realizing that she was running out of procedural excuses for refusing to honor documentation that everyone else seemed to recognize as perfectly legitimate. The confirmation number was clearly printed. The seat assignment was unambiguous. The flight details were correct, and even her own subordinate had acknowledged that everything appeared authentic according to standard airline documentation. "The question," she said, her voice rising slightly as she felt the need to justify her position to an increasingly skeptical audience, "is whether this passenger fits the profile of someone who would legitimately purchase a first-class seat on this route, especially given the timing of the booking and the premium nature of the seat assignment." The words came out before Rebecca fully realized what she was saying, crossing a line from procedural concerns into explicit profiling that would be impossible to defend under any interpretation of company policy or federal anti-discrimination law. The gate area went completely silent as passengers processed what they had just heard. A senior airline employee openly admitting that she was denying service based on her assessment of whether someone fit the profile of a premium passenger. Diego stood frozen behind his computer terminal, his mouth slightly open as he realized his supervisor had just confessed to discrimination in front of dozens of witnesses while being recorded by multiple passengers. He looked at the boarding pass in Rebecca's hand, then at his screen showing Jasmine's completely valid reservation, then back at Rebecca with dawning horror at what she had just said. Taylor Kim spoke directly into her phone camera, her voice barely above a whisper, but clear enough for her viewers to understand the gravity of what they were witnessing. "Y'all," she said, her live stream viewer count now approaching 800 as word spread through social media that something extraordinary was happening at LAX. "This woman just admitted she's profiling this girl based on whether she fits some kind of profile for first-class passengers. This is absolutely insane, and I can't believe this is happening in 2024. Her comment section was scrolling too fast to read, filled with outrage and disbelief from viewers who were watching racial discrimination unfold in real time while being broadcast to hundreds of people across social media platforms. Screenshots were being taken, recordings were being saved, and multiple passengers were now documenting the incident from different angles to ensure that nothing would be lost or disputed later. Airport Security Supervisor Johnson had been monitoring the situation from a distance after receiving reports of a passenger disturbance at Gate 23, but Rebecca's admission about profiling had moved the incident into territory that required immediate intervention. A 25-year veteran of airport security with gray hair and the tired eyes of someone who had seen every possible variation of human behavior in transportation settings, he approached the gate with the purposeful stride of someone who knew exactly what kind of situation he was walking into. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of federal law enforcement as he surveyed the scene with professional assessment. "I'm Supervisor Johnson with Airport Security. We've received reports of a passenger service issue, and I'm here to ensure that everyone's rights are protected while we resolve whatever questions have arisen." He looked around the gate area, taking in the crowd of passengers with phones pointed toward the confrontation, the obvious tension radiating from Rebecca behind her counter and Jasmine standing calmly in the middle of it all with the kind of composure that suggested someone who understood exactly what was happening and wasn't going to be intimidated into accepting treatment she didn't deserve. "Ma'am," he said to Rebecca, his voice carrying the professional courtesy that law enforcement officers use when they want to give someone a chance to explain themselves before taking official action. "Can you explain to me exactly what's happening here and why we have reports of a passenger service issue that's attracted this much attention?" Rebecca straightened her blazer and composed herself, seeing Johnson's arrival as an opportunity to reassert her authority and gain official support for her position. "Supervisor Johnson," she said, her voice taking on the professional tone she used when dealing with law enforcement officials. "Thank you for responding to this situation. We have a passenger who has been attempting to board with questionable documentation, and when I've tried to follow proper security verification procedures, she's been argumentative and disruptive to our legitimate passengers." She gestured toward Jasmine with the kind of dismissive wave that suggested the matter should be simple for a law enforcement officer to resolve. "I've requested that she step aside so we can verify her documentation through proper channels, but she's refused to cooperate and has been causing a scene that's delayed our boarding process and inconvenienced everyone else." Supervisor Johnson looked at Jasmine with the neutral expression of someone who had learned to withhold judgment until he had heard all sides of a situation. "Ma'am," he said, "can I see some identification, please?" Jasmine pulled out her driver's license and handed it to him without hesitation, her movements calm and confident in the way that suggested someone who had nothing to hide from law enforcement scrutiny. Johnson examined the license carefully under his flashlight, checking for signs of forgery or tampering, running his fingers over the raised lettering and holographic security features that would be nearly impossible to replicate convincingly. The license was completely legitimate, current, properly issued, matching Jasmine's appearance perfectly with no flags or irregularities that would suggest identity theft or document fraud. "And your boarding pass?" he asked, his voice maintaining the same neutral professionalism. "She destroyed it," Jasmine said simply, holding up the pieces of torn cardstock that had once been her printed boarding pass. "She ripped it up in front of everyone without ever scanning it or verifying it in their computer system." Supervisor Johnson looked at Rebecca with raised eyebrows, his expression shifting from neutral inquiry to the kind of focused attention that law enforcement officers give to situations that might require official action. "You destroyed a passenger's boarding pass?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of disbelief that suggested such behavior was far outside normal procedure. "I disposed of suspicious documentation following established company security protocols," Rebecca replied, her customer service training helping her phrase her actions in language that sounded more official and less discriminatory than the reality of what she had done. "Did you scan it first to verify whether it was authentic?" Johnson asked, his question cutting directly to the heart of whether Rebecca had followed actual security procedures or had simply acted on personal prejudices. Rebecca hesitated for just a moment, realizing that her answer would either justify her actions or expose them as discriminatory and unprofessional. "I used my professional judgment to determine that scanning wasn't necessary based on other factors that raised questions about the passenger's legitimacy." Supervisor Johnson had been working airport security long enough to recognize when a situation was about to explode into the kind of viral incident that generates congressional hearings and ends careers in spectacular fashion. He had seen videos of airline discrimination incidents spread across social media platforms, destroying reputations and costing companies millions of dollars in legal settlements and lost business. The combination of a passenger with legitimate documentation, an employee who had admitted to profiling, and dozens of witnesses recording everything on their phones was a recipe for the kind of public relations disaster that could reach the highest levels of corporate and federal oversight. "Miss," he said to Jasmine, his voice carrying the careful courtesy of someone who wanted to de-escalate a situation before it spiraled completely out of control. "Do you have any other documentation for this flight that we can verify?" Jasmine held up her phone, displaying the digital boarding pass that had been clearly visible on her screen throughout this entire confrontation. "I have the electronic version right here," she said, "along with the credit card I used to purchase the ticket and my frequent flyer account information that shows the booking details." Johnson looked at the phone screen, taking in the crisp QR code, the clear seat assignment, and the flight details that matched exactly what should be displayed for a legitimate first-class passenger on this flight. He turned back to Rebecca, his expression growing more serious as he realized that she had destroyed valid documentation without any reasonable justification. "Ma'am," he said to Rebecca, his voice taking on the official tone that law enforcement officers use when they're moving from inquiry to potential enforcement action, "can you verify this passenger's reservation in your computer system?" Rebecca glanced nervously at Diego, who was still standing behind his terminal with the passenger manifest clearly displayed on his screen. She realized that verifying Jasmine's reservation would prove that the boarding pass she had destroyed was completely legitimate, which would expose her actions as discriminatory and potentially criminal destruction of valid travel documents. "Computer records can be manipulated," she said weakly, grasping at any excuse that might justify her continued refusal to acknowledge what everyone else could see clearly. Supervisor Johnson followed her gaze to Diego's computer screen and walked over to examine the passenger manifest himself. The display showed Jasmine's reservation in perfect detail. Seat 1, a first-class fare full payment booked 3 weeks in advance, no irregularities or flags that would justify questioning her right to board the aircraft. "This shows a valid reservation with full payment and no security concerns," he said, turning back to Rebecca with an expression that suggested he was running out of patience with her explanations. "Can you tell me exactly why you destroyed this passenger's boarding pass when your own computer system confirms her legitimate right to travel?" Rebecca felt every eye in the gate area focused on her as she realized that she was trapped between admitting she had acted discriminatorily or continuing to defend actions that were becoming more obviously unjustifiable with each passing moment. The businessman was still on the phone with customer service Taylor. Kim was still broadcasting to hundreds of viewers, and Diego was staring at her with the kind of disappointed expression that suggested he would not be supporting her version of events when corporate investigators began asking questions. She had 2 choices: admit that she had been wrong from the beginning and face the consequences of her discriminatory behavior, or double down one final time and hope that her authority as senior gate agent would somehow override the obvious evidence that she had targeted Jasmine based on assumptions about her appearance and economic status, rather than any legitimate security concerns. Officer Rebecca said, her voice taking on a desperate edge as she made her final attempt to justify the unjustifiable, "This passenger simply doesn't fit the profile of our typical first-class customers. She's dressed inappropriately for premium service. She's been argumentative and confrontational throughout this interaction, and she's caused significant disruption to our boarding process that has inconvenienced every other passenger waiting to board this aircraft." The words fell into the gate area like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of shocked silence that spread across the crowd of witnesses who had just heard a senior airline employee openly admit to discrimination based on appearance, demeanor, and her personal assessment of who belonged in first-class accommodations. Jasmine looked around at the dozens of people staring at her with expressions ranging from sympathy to outrage to simple disbelief that they were witnessing such blatant discrimination in a public place in 2024. She pulled out her iPhone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she needed, the one contact that could end this entire situation with a single phone call. "Officer Martinez," she said, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet gate area. "I'd like to make a phone call before this goes any further." "To your lawyer," Rebecca interrupted sarcastically, her desperation making her lash out in ways that would only make her situation worse when this incident was inevitably reviewed by corporate management and federal authorities. Jasmine didn't respond to the taunt. She simply tapped the contact labeled Dad, Work, and selected the video call option, knowing that what was about to happen would change everything for everyone involved in this confrontation. The phone rang once, twice, and on the third ring, the screen connected to show a face that made several passengers near Jasmine gasp in immediate recognition. David Washington appeared on the screen wearing an expensive charcoal suit, seated behind an imposing desk in what was clearly a corporate executive office, with floor-to-ceiling windows showing the Los Angeles skyline stretching out behind him. "Jasmine, sweetheart," his voice boomed from the phone's speaker, warm and filled with paternal affection. As he smiled at his daughter through the screen, "You should be 30,000 feet over Arizona by now. The flight was supposed to depart 20 minutes ago, according to my flight tracking app." Jasmine turned the phone so the camera showed her face clearly, and David's expression immediately shifted from casual concern to laser-focused attention as he recognized the stress in his daughter's expression and the unusual setting of what appeared to be a gate area filled with people rather than an aircraft cabin. "Hi, Dad." Jasmine said, her voice steady despite the extraordinary nature of what she was about to reveal to everyone within earshot. "I'm still at gate 23, but I'm having a problem with one of your employees who says I don't belong in first class and destroyed my boarding pass." The silence on the other end of the phone connection was absolute and terrifying. The kind of quiet that suggests someone is processing information that will change everything about the next few minutes. David Washington's expression underwent a transformation that made several passengers step back involuntarily. Warmth disappearing, replaced by the kind of controlled fury that comes from a man who built a billion-dollar airline from nothing and wasn't accustomed to having his family treated with anything less than complete respect. She did what his voice was quiet but dangerous, carrying the authority of someone who controlled the employment of 30,000 people and the travel experience of millions of passengers every year. "She tore up my boarding pass right in front of everyone," Jasmine explained, holding up the pieces of destroyed card stock for the camera. "She said I was trying to steal an upgrade and that I didn't fit the profile of first-class passengers. She called security to have me removed, even though Diego confirmed my reservation in the computer." David's jaw tightened visibly as he processed this information, and when he spoke again, his voice filled the entire gate area with the unmistakable authority of someone who was about to make decisions that would have consequences for everyone involved. "Put her on speaker, Jasmine," he commanded, his voice carrying the tone that had built Horizon Airlines into one of the most successful carriers in the world. "Loudspeaker so everyone can hear this conversation." Jasmine tapped the speaker button, and David Washington's voice rang out across Gate 23 with crystal clarity, reaching every passenger, every airport employee, and every phone that was recording this unprecedented moment when corporate accountability met family protection in real time. "This is David Washington, Chief Executive Officer and founder of Horizon Airlines," he announced, his words carrying like thunder across the terminal's space. "To whom am I speaking?" Every phone in the gate area was now pointed at Rebecca, whose face had gone completely white beneath her carefully applied makeup, as she realized that she had been discriminating against the daughter of the man who owned the airline she worked for. Her hands began to shake visibly as the full implications of her behavior crashed down on her like a collapsing building. "Mr. Washington," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper, as 16 years of career confidence evaporated in an instant. "Sir, this is Rebecca Sterling, Senior Gate Agent here at LAX. There's been some kind of misunderstanding about this situation." "There's been no misunderstanding, Ms. Sterling," David interrupted, his voice cutting through her attempted explanation like a blade through paper. You destroyed my daughter's boarding pass and called security to have her removed from first class. Explain to me exactly why you thought that was appropriate behavior toward any passenger, let alone my child." Rebecca looked around desperately at the crowd of passengers all staring at her with expressions that ranged from shock to anticipation as they realized they were about to witness corporate justice delivered in real time. Taylor Kim had moved closer with her phone, her live stream viewer count now approaching 1,500 as word spread through social media that something extraordinary was happening at LAX Gate 23. Sir Rebecca said, her voice cracking under the pressure of having to justify her actions to the one person who could end her career with a single sentence. The passenger didn't appear to match the profile of our typical first-class clientele, and I had concerns about the authenticity of her documentation based on my 16 years of experience in this industry. "Stop talking," David commanded, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who was not going to tolerate any more excuses or justifications. "Did you scan her boarding pass before destroying it?" Rebecca realized that every word she spoke was being recorded by dozens of phones and would be analyzed by lawyers, investigators, and social media users for evidence of discrimination and corporate misconduct. "Sir, I used my professional judgment to determine that—" "Did you scan it, yes or no?" The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall, and Rebecca knew that her answer would determine not just her employment status, but her ability to work anywhere in the airline industry ever again. "No, sir," she whispered. "Did you verify her reservation in your computer system before accusing her of fraud?" "No, sir." The gate area was so quiet that the air conditioning vents overhead sounded like wind turbines, and even the ambient terminal noise seemed to fade as hundreds of people found themselves witnessing corporate accountability delivered with surgical precision in front of a live audience that would ensure nothing could be covered up or denied later. "So you destroyed valid documentation belonging to a confirmed passenger without any verification or evidence of wrongdoing." David summarized, his voice deadly calm as he laid out the facts that would be impossible to dispute. "Mrs. Sterling, you didn't just discriminate against my daughter. You profiled her based on her appearance, abused your authority as a senior employee, and created a public spectacle that is currently being broadcast to thousands of people on social media." Rebecca felt panic rising in her chest as she realized that her career was ending in real time, broadcast live to an audience that would ensure she never worked in customer service again. "Mr. Washington, please," she said, her voice breaking as 16 years of professional identity crumbled around her. "I have a mortgage, a family, 16 years of service with this company." This was just a misunderstanding about procedures and security protocols. "It was not a misunderstanding, Ms. Sterling," David replied, his voice carrying the weight of absolute finality. "It was a choice. You chose to discriminate against my daughter. You chose to abuse your authority. You chose to embarrass my company and endanger every employee's job with your prejudiced behavior." Diego stood transfixed behind his computer terminal, watching his supervisor's career implode while being broadcast to thousands of viewers who were witnessing corporate justice delivered with unprecedented speed and transparency. He had pulled up Rebecca's employee record on his screen, already knowing that he would need to take over all gate operations within the next few minutes. Effective immediately, David continued, his voice carrying across the gate area with perfect clarity. "You are terminated from Horizon Airlines. Security will escort you from the premises. You will surrender your badge, access cards, and any company property. Your final paycheck will be mailed to your address on file, and you are permanently banned from all Horizon Airlines property." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of stunned silence that spread across the entire terminal as passengers processed what they had just witnessed. The CEO of a major airline firing an employee live on social media for discriminating against his daughter. Taylor Kim's comment section exploded with reactions as her live stream captured every moment of the most dramatic corporate accountability moment in recent memory. "Oh my God" appeared dozens of times in her feed along with "Justice, and that's what happens when you mess with the wrong person," and "This is the best thing I've ever watched." Rebecca looked around the gate area one final time, seeing her 16-year career scattered on the floor like the pieces of Jasmine's boarding pass she had torn up in her moment of prejudiced authority. Airport security was already approaching to escort her from the premises, and Diego was moving to take over her station with the kind of efficiency that suggested he had been prepared for this possibility. "Ladies and gentlemen," David's voice continued reaching every corner of the gate area through Jasmine's phone speaker. "I apologize to every passenger who witnessed this incident. This employee's behavior does not represent the values or standards of Horizon Airlines. Diego Rodriguez will now handle your boarding process personally, and I will be implementing company-wide changes to ensure nothing like this ever happens again." He paused, looking directly into the camera through Jasmine's phone, addressing not just the passengers at Gate 23, but the thousands of people watching through Taylor's live stream, and the millions who would see recordings of this incident in the hours and days to come. "To anyone watching this on social media," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that this moment would define his company's legacy, "you've just witnessed both the problem and the solution. The problem is that discrimination still exists in positions of authority. The solution is that there are always consequences when that prejudice is exposed to the light." Within 6 hours of Rebecca Sterling's termination, David Washington was seated in the emergency boardroom of Horizon Airlines Los Angeles headquarters, surrounded by his executive team, legal department, and crisis management consultants, who had been called in to handle what was rapidly becoming a defining moment for the entire airline industry. The Rebecca Sterling incident had exploded across social media platforms, generating over 5 million views in the first 4 hours and trending in 12 countries as news outlets picked up the story of a CEO firing his own employee live on social media for discriminating against his daughter. Stock analysts were calling it either the most brilliant piece of crisis management in corporate history, or a potential liability nightmare that could expose Horizon Airlines to discrimination lawsuits from every passenger who had ever been treated poorly by airline employees. Sir said Elena Rodriguez, the company's chief legal officer, as she pulled up social media analytics showing the viral spread of Taylor Kim's live stream recording. "We're getting calls from congressional offices, civil rights organizations, and media outlets from around the world. This story is reaching far beyond airline industry trade publications." David nodded grimly, understanding that his split-second decision to fire Rebecca publicly had created ripple effects that would reshape not just his company, but the entire transportation industry's approach to customer service and employee accountability. "Good," he said, surprising his legal team with his response. "Maybe it's time this industry faced some real consequences for treating passengers like Rebecca treated Jasmine." Over the next 48 hours, David announced what he called the Washington Protocol, a comprehensive overhaul of every customer service procedure at Horizon Airlines that would become the gold standard for anti-discrimination practices in the transportation industry. The changes weren't cosmetic adjustments to existing policies. They were fundamental restructuring of how airline employees interacted with passengers with mandatory training programs, real-time monitoring systems, and immediate consequences for discriminatory behavior. Every customer service employee would receive 40 hours of bias recognition training annually, not the standard online modules that most companies used, but intensive workshops led by civil rights experts, psychologists, and former discrimination victims, who could help employees understand how unconscious prejudices affected their decision-making processes and how to interrupt those patterns before they became harmful actions. Authority and accountability measures meant that no employee would ever again have the power to deny boarding to any passenger with valid documentation without supervisor approval, computer verification, and automatic recording of the interaction for later review. The technology existed to create transparency. David was simply requiring his company to use it properly. Customer feedback integration included a new mobile app feature that allowed passengers to rate their service experience in real time with automatic alerts to management for any comments mentioning discrimination, profiling, or treatment based on appearance, race, age, or economic status. Comments would trigger immediate investigation, and employees would face swift consequences for verified incidents. The changes attracted attention from other airlines whose executives privately worried about setting precedents that would be expensive to implement industry-wide. But customers loved the transparency and accountability measures, with booking requests flooding Horizon Airlines from passengers who wanted to fly with the carrier that actually fired racist employees instead of hiding behind legal protections and corporate procedures. Within 30 days, 3 more Horizon Airlines employees were terminated for bias-related incidents that wouldn't have been noticed under the old system. Each termination was swift, well-documented, and publicly acknowledged, sending a clear message that the changes weren't performative gestures but fundamental shifts in how the company operated. Congresswoman Maria Santos, chairwoman of the House Transportation Committee, announced federal hearings on airline discrimination after watching Taylor Kim's viral live stream. The Sterling incident proves that discrimination in transportation isn't rare, she said in her opening statement that was broadcast live on C-SPAN. It's just rarely documented with this level of clarity. We're going to examine whether federal oversight is necessary to ensure all airlines meet the standards that Horizon Airlines has set voluntarily. The hearings drew testimony from civil rights advocates, industry executives, and discrimination victims whose stories had never received the attention that Jasmine's experience generated. David testified as well, describing the Washington Protocol and challenging other airlines to adopt similar standards rather than waiting for federal mandates to force changes they should have implemented years earlier. Other airlines began implementing their own versions of the Washington Protocol, though most were less comprehensive than Horizon's original framework. American Airlines announced mandatory bias training for all customer service employees. United created a passenger advocacy office with direct reporting to corporate leadership. Delta implemented real-time discrimination reporting measures that bypassed local management and went directly to federal oversight. The Rebecca Sterling incident had become a catalyst for industry-wide transformation, proving that social media accountability could drive corporate responsibility more effectively than years of traditional advocacy and regulatory pressure. When discrimination was documented, shared, and resulted in immediate consequences, other companies moved quickly to avoid becoming the next viral example of corporate prejudice. Rebecca herself discovered the long-term consequences of viral infamy in the age of permanent digital records. Despite multiple attempts to find employment in customer service, retail, or hospitality, her name was too recognizable and her behavior too well documented for any company willing to risk association with discriminatory practices. She had moved to a small town in Oregon and taken work in a warehouse far from any customer interaction that might trigger recognition or create liability for her employers. The lesson was clear and permanent in an age of social media documentation. Prejudice had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate incident affecting employment prospects, social relationships, and basic quality of life for years to come. Diego Rodriguez, meanwhile, had thrived in his promotion to senior gate agent, implementing the respectful customer service protocols that became the industry standard. When asked about that day at LAX, he always emphasized how Rebecca's behavior had shocked him and how the new training programs helped employees recognize and interrupt their own biases before they could harm passengers. The industry transformation accelerated when major corporations in other sectors began adopting elements of the Washington Protocol for their own customer service operations. Hotels, restaurants, retail chains, any business with customer-facing employees found value in the comprehensive approach to bias prevention that had emerged from a single incident of viral accountability at an airport gate. 6 months after that evening at LAX Gate 23, Jasmine Washington walked across the stage at New York University School of Law to receive her Juris Doctor degree, summa cum laude, with her family beaming from the audience and her future stretching ahead with possibilities that felt both earned and inevitable. The graduation ceremony was held in Washington Square Park, with family members filling folding chairs under a canopy of spring trees and pride radiating from every corner of the beautiful outdoor setting. David Washington sat in the front row wearing his best suit and fighting back tears as his daughter accepted her diploma, while next to him sat Dr. Angela Washington, Jasmine's mother, a pediatric surgeon who had flown in from her conference in Chicago specifically for this moment. "That's our girl David," whispered to his wife as Jasmine shook the dean's hand and posed for official photos with the kind of composed smile that had characterized her approach to every challenge life had presented, including the discrimination she had faced 6 months earlier. The incident at Gate 23 had become part of Jasmine's law school legacy, referenced in constitutional law classes discussing civil rights and corporate responsibility, cited in student essays about justice and accountability, and studied in business schools as a case study in crisis management and social media's power to create immediate consequences for discriminatory behavior. But Jasmine wore that recognition lightly, focusing instead on her studies and her future career in civil rights law with Morrison Chen and Associates, one of the most prestigious firms in the country, specializing in corporate discrimination cases. Her first assignment would be representing airline passengers who had been wrongfully removed from flights using the legal precedent established by her father's swift response to build stronger protections for travelers who might otherwise suffer in silence. After graduation, the family celebrated with dinner at their favorite restaurant overlooking the Hudson River, watching the sunset paint the water gold and orange while reflecting on how much had changed since that difficult evening when discrimination had been met with immediate accountability. "You know," David said, raising his glass of sparkling water in a toast to his daughter, "people still ask me if I regret firing Rebecca so publicly, if the punishment was too severe for someone with 16 years of service." "And what do you tell them?" Jasmine asked, though she already knew her father's answer from the dozens of interviews he had given about the incident and its aftermath. "I tell them that Rebecca had probably treated hundreds of passengers badly over those 16 years, but no one with power was watching. No one with authority was paying attention." David replied, his voice carrying the conviction that had driven him to build an airline based on treating every passenger with dignity, regardless of their appearance or economic status. The moment someone was watching, the moment there were real consequences. The discriminatory behavior stopped not just at our airline, but across the entire industry. Jasmine nodded, understanding that her experience had become something larger than personal vindication. It had become a catalyst for protecting countless other travelers who would never face the kind of treatment she had endured because corporate policies had changed in response to viral accountability. A year later, Jasmine was presenting her first major case to a federal appeals court, representing a family who had been removed from a flight due to what the airline claimed were security concerns, but what the evidence showed was discrimination based on religious appearance. The legal framework established by the Washington Protocol had created stronger protections for passengers and clearer consequences for airlines that failed to treat customers with equal dignity. The Washington Standard, as legal scholars had begun calling it, had established that corporate accountability couldn't wait for lengthy investigations or bureaucratic procedures when discrimination was clearly documented. Social media transparency had created a new form of immediate justice that complemented, rather than replaced, traditional legal remedies. On a recent flight from New York to Los Angeles, her first time flying since that evening at LAX, Jasmine had been treated with universal respect by airline employees who recognized her name and understood that she represented both the problem of discrimination and the solution of accountability. But more importantly, she observed other passengers of all backgrounds being treated with the same courtesy and professionalism that should have been standard long before viral videos forced the industry to change. During the flight, she had written in her journal about the strange journey from law school graduate to civil rights advocate, noting that sometimes the most important cases weren't argued in courtrooms, but resolved in airport terminals when people with power chose to use that power responsibly instead of defensively. The young girl in the seat across the aisle, maybe 8 years old and traveling alone under the airline's unaccompanied minor program, was receiving attentive care from flight attendants who understood that every passenger deserved respect regardless of age, race, or ticket price. Watching that interaction, Jasmine realized that her experience had helped create a world where that child would never face the kind of discrimination she had encountered, and that made every uncomfortable moment of viral fame worthwhile. When she returned home that evening, Jasmine called her father to thank him not for firing Rebecca Sterling, but for teaching her through his example that dignity was something that could never be taken away by others, only surrendered by oneself. The most important thing you did that night, she told him, wasn't firing someone who treated me badly. It was raising a daughter who knew she belonged exactly where she was standing and wouldn't accept anything less than the respect she deserved. David's response would stay with her forever. "Sweetheart, I didn't teach you dignity. I just made sure you had examples of what it looked like when people chose to do the right thing even when it was difficult." Thank you for watching this incredible story of justice, dignity, and the power of accountability. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and share it with others who need to see that discrimination has consequences when good people refuse to stay silent. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about real people standing up for what's right. And remember that sometimes the most important changes happen not through years of struggle, but through single moments of courage when someone refuses to accept treatment they don't deserve.